Thank you for joining us today on the Grieving with God podcast. I'm so excited that you're here for part 2 of the interview with Kimalee Finelli and her book, Under Authority. We're going to finish our discussion this week about abuses in the church. What does it look like? How do you get out from under something like that? And does a pastor really have all the authority? And so we kind of go into some of these questions and dive into our own experiences as teenagers. So I hope you enjoy this episode. And again, if you like it, subscribe, hit the like button, share it, and leave a comment. We'd love to know what you think and see if there's anything you would like us to do or change. If there's a topic that you think we should cover, I would love to hear about it.
I think that finding that support, finding therapy is really helpful in learning to trust yourself again, learning to trust others, and learning to trust that God did not abandon you. Just because something happened to you, God has not abandoned you.
I love that because I think
not. He's just trying to give you that space. He's there for you. He wants you to heal. And
it feels like that, when I talk, especially, we've done a lot of episodes on miscarriage and infant loss. And when you lose something so intimate, right? So something you long for, and dream of, and how could God take a baby? When those things happen, when you have grief like this, it does feel like God has abandoned you. And it can be so easy to just stay in that anger and stay in that feeling of abandonment. But I like that you said surrounding yourselves with other people who can support you and help you, uplift you, pray for you, keep you close to the side of God and Jesus. Because trust is going to take time to build that trust back up when you've had something traumatic like this happen to you.
And another thing about the people, it was such a different group of people for me, because this was a new group of people that were telling me that there was nothing wrong with me, that I was okay, that I was not a rebellious teenager, a rebellious adult, and I was able to think for myself and make decisions for myself, and that God was not going to punish me for some sin that I may have committed somewhere along the way, and everything was going to be okay, and that God had a plan for my life. And when you grow up in a church where there's so much oppression and so much judgment, that was such a breath of fresh air, and it meant everything to me. So getting into the right group of people, the right support, is monumental.
And some people might hear this and say, well, why would you stay? Why would you subject yourself to something that is obviously so false? But when you're raised in it, or when it can be so compelling, the words coming out of their mouths, you're like, I guess that is true. You're a pastor. You're someone who's supposed to lead me and guide me and protect me and show me Jesus and God. So what's coming from the pulpit must be true. So for some people, it's hard for them to understand why we stayed, why the light bulb didn't come on sooner. But it's just hard when you're in the middle of this and you're surrounded by other people who believe all this, and you start thinking things. You're like, I'm the only one here who thinks there's something wrong. So when did you start really seeing, or when did the light bulb start coming on for you that something's wrong here?
I noticed it very early. I was 13 years old in that church when I said, wow, something isn't right here. And I mentioned it to my mother. I was hushed pretty quickly, because we don't question authority, and we don't question pastor especially. And so she hushed me pretty quickly. Don't ask questions. You just follow along. And then I thought, so then I started noticing more things, and then I started noticing more things and more things. So I was very young, because to me, the pastor was very big on preaching a sermon according to his agenda. There was always a hidden agenda, a hidden message that he wanted to get across. And so he would find a verse in the Bible, take it, and say, this is what it means, and you can't question me. And he would take it, pull it out of context completely, twist it, shape it for his agenda. And I remember just sitting there as a young teenage girl in sermons, just looking down at my Bible and looking at him and looking down. I'm like, and looking at everybody else around the congregation. Like, does everybody have a confused look on their face like I do? So I was
Yeah.
very young when I noticed, but the feeling never
Yeah.
left me. It never left me. And I always knew this isn't right. And this isn't, my Bible says this, and that's not what he
And so
said.
obviously we look back now when we say, okay, that's the pull of God. That's God tugging on your heart, pulling on your heart, revealing things to your spirit because he has a plan for you. He pulled you out of that. I mean, now we can look back and say, wow, God really was working in your life at a very early age. I was college age when the light bulb started coming on. Yeah. So we did talk about religious trauma can be very deeply isolating. Did you ever feel like there was anyone who understood what you were going through or understood the trauma that you went through?
There were a few, most of the time I was very alone because we weren't supposed to speak
Yeah.
about how we were feeling. You weren't supposed to, feelings were kind of a
Mm-hmm.
no-no in that church. It was obey. Everything was all about obedience. And when there was feelings involved, that leads to questions, and questions leads to disobedience. So there's really, any feelings were shut
Mm-hmm.
down. So I felt, as far as growing up in that church, I was on my
Yeah.
own. I was on my own. It wasn't until I was an older teenager, like a senior, probably in high school, where I was starting to really be able to present things to my parents. And even then, I had to be careful about it
Mm-hmm.
and make sure it was only done at
Yeah.
home.
Right.
In case, God, God forbid, we ran into someone in public, in the grocery store even, and we were overheard because it was a small town. We ran into everybody
Right.
everywhere.
Right.
So that definitely happened. So I was very careful and I was careful to present, um, if I had a question in my mind, that it didn't seem like I was questioning the
Right.
pastor, that I would just, hey, I'm curious about
Mm-hmm.
something. I kind of had to be careful about presenting it like that, even to my parents,
Yeah.
until it started getting their wheels turning
Yeah.
too. And I think my mom now will now say, I always knew I didn't fit in. I thought there was something wrong with me.
Yeah.
So she always knew. So I was growing up, I was on my
Mm-hmm.
own for sure. But once I was surrounding myself with the people that definitely helped me realize this is not the true
Right.
Jesus. Uh, and those were the people that really showed me. But I was already probably into college at that point.
So you come out of this church, you're alone. You've been hurt by people who are supposed to protect you, religious leaders, you know, church people, and you find your way to God. You start defining your foundations again on who God is. How did you then begin to rebuild or reconcile or come back into the community, the church community? How did you come back to being able to be in a church? For me, it was very difficult. I had to find a completely opposite church community to get back in. And I remember the first time my husband he's like, no, when we're going to go to this church, and the name Baptist was in the title, and it wasn't Independent Fundamentalist Baptist, but my brain is saying, no. And I cried walking into the building and I was shaking because it was so traumatic to come back into the environment where I was hurt for such a long time. And thank God that church had no resemblance at all to the church that I was raised in. But how did you get back into the church community and come back into fellowship with other believers?
Honestly, it is something that I still struggle
Mm-hmm.
with from time to time. I do go to church, and yes, the Baptist is in the
Mm-hmm.
name, but I try to understand that as long as the pastor is preaching the
Mm-hmm.
truth and it's not his own agenda, and the pastor is truly caring about his congregation and wanting, yes, he's the shepherd, there's the shepherd of the flock, but he's not the dictator
That's
of the
right.
flock either. So that is something that I look
Mm-hmm.
for. And I always want to make sure that the pastor truly loves
Mm-hmm.
Jesus and is not, I would say, in love with himself or, in love with
Power.
a
Yeah.
control or a title, the power. Definitely, definitely all of those. And I have visited, I live in the Bible Belt of South Carolina. So we visited a lot of churches
Mm-hmm.
here. And there was a few that my husband and thankfully we're on the same page. He is just like me. He's like, I'm not going, that's not
Right.
happening. So we've visited a few. Some of them didn't, it was just the name of a road. And we thought, well, let's try this one. It's not far from the house. And we tried it and we ended up leaving and very quickly after the sermon because we recognized uh, some things very quickly. But I have to remind myself a lot. It is not about a
Mm-hmm.
pastor. It is not about a church building. It is about Jesus says, come unto me,
Mm-hmm.
all you who are weary and heavy laden. And we're all heavy
Yeah.
laden. And that is what I focus on. Come to me. And my relationship with Jesus is something that no one can
Mm-hmm.
judge. No one, between me and
Right.
God. And it's not about a church. I would be, even if I decided one day if I was struggling and wanted to just sit at home with my Bible and my notebook
Mm-hmm.
and just have a moment with God all by myself. Sometimes those are the best churches that I've ever experienced. I talk about in my book a prayer meeting that I had with just one other family, and we all came in a circle and we had a prayer
Mm-hmm.
together about a family that had been destroyed by the
Mm-hmm.
reverend. He actually spoke of a marriage
Oh,
in the
wow.
church, and it was
Yeah.
devastating. And because there were some repercussions for that, and it was really devastating. I talk about it in my story, but I would say in my book, I say it was the best church experience that I've ever been. It was the best church I've ever experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Just in that one prayer meeting where nobody was judged, no lightning bolts came out of the sky,
Right.
and felt the presence of
Yeah.
Jesus and his love for us in that moment. And that's what I focus on. I focus on my relationship with
Mm-hmm.
Jesus. Jesus I follow the one through Jesus. I do not follow a
Yep.
man.
Right.
And I go to church to learn and to worship together. And that is, and to gain something and to give back when I can. But it's between me and Jesus, is because God knows
Yeah.
my
And
heart.
I think, when we reflect on what kind of people are drawn into these kinds of churches, why are they still so prominent? I think because I think as humans, we long for a place to belong. We long for sometimes for someone to just tell us what to do. We get a little lazy. We don't want to have our own relationship with Jesus. We want to be told what to believe. And if it sounds good and if it aligns with our own prejudices and biases,
Yeah,
then it's comfortable to
absolutely.
us. But sometimes what Jesus wants to do is call us out on our prejudices and biases and call them sin and call them wrong. And so there's a lot of spiritual work that you have to do on your own to find out what your relationship is with God. What
Mhm.
does that look like? Who is Jesus to you?
And it's letting go of that fear of failure, the fear of isolation, the fear of what's out there beyond this life that I've always
Right.
known. And there is a lot of fear involved in that, and the fear of say maybe punishment from the pastor, or while you're still in
Yeah.
there, and there's so much fear, and the pastor leeches onto
Yeah.
that, and that is what he uses to control his congregation. But there is so much freedom on the other side of letting that go.
So we talked, a lot about you coming out of this church and the support that you had and finding Jesus and finding God again. Coming back into the church community, we know is still hard. There's still sometimes it's hard for me. What would you say to churches to maybe protect themselves against becoming something like this church that you were in, or to protect themselves from harming or hurting their congregation in such a way that it is traumatic and unbiblical?
I believe the key is
Mm-hmm.
accountability. Accountability is everything. Having a pastor that has maybe only one or two elders, or a very small deacon board, and he just is in control of everything, is usually not a good
Mm-hmm.
idea. when I know that there is going to be a pastor, there's going to be leadership, yes, but he needs a team of accountability. And therefore, they can come to him and feel comfortable saying, we understand that you want to talk about this and preach on this, but we feel we've been talking about this and we feel that this is not how we're looking at this
Right, right.
scripture. And your delivery is maybe going to come across this way, and the application may come across
Yeah,
that way. So I believe that having an accountability team in a church
I
is
agree.
key to really being watchful and having that spiritual
Yeah,
awareness. That awareness that if you're not careful, that pastor can maybe even
yeah,
unknowingly, uh, just say something, and maybe that's his interpretation of something, and somebody takes it the wrong
hmm,
way, or he took it one way and says everybody has to take it this way, but that's not exactly how you could take
hmm,
it. I've been under many, many sermons in my life, and I think interpretation is everything. So I think having that accountability is going to be key in the awareness of
yes.
spiritual
And I think
abuse.
also making sure that the pastor is not invincible, meaning he can be removed from his post if needed. Having a
Absolutely.
board of directors, some people don't like that idea, but having a board of directors that you said keep them accountable, keep them on the right track, but also let them know, hey, you are serving the church, you are shepherding the body here. This is not your building, this isn't your church. And so kind of removing some of the level of power and autonomy, I guess, from the
Absolutely.
pastor, and
Yeah.
making sure that there is a balance, which is tricky. I've been
Yeah. And I like that word balance. I think that is the perfect word to use.
so someone, who might be coming out of churches like this because they are not archaic. You and I both know they are still around, and there are still people in these churches, and some of them may not be called independent fundamentalist Baptists anymore. They might have come with a different name. They might come with different focuses. Some our growing up, ours was like purity and listening to authority. Authority is never wrong. So maybe it's got a different kind of message today. But we do know that these damaging churches are still around, and we know, I know you and I both know a lot of people who have been hurt deeply by the church. So what would you say to someone who feels like they're hurt by the church? Maybe they're still in the church and they're afraid of losing everything, or they've left the church and they have lost everything. Like what would be your encouragement to them?
My first thing that I would say to them is it is okay to talk about
Mm,
it. I think a lot of people
yeah,
think that they cannot talk about it, that it is nobody's going to understand me, nobody's going to know what I go through, nobody's going to get me, nobody's going to get this. And one thing that I've learned since this book has come out is it is bigger than we think,
mm-hmm,
and it happens to more people
yeah,
than we think. This not only the spiritual abuse, but the isolation and the loss and
yeah,
the grief. All of it it's all
yeah,
hand in hand,
yeah,
all of it, and learning who they are without
yeah,
it. And it's okay to talk about it, and that is something that I would like to raise awareness of.
mhm,
Is talk about it with that, find those people that can support
yes,
you. And there are therapists out there that specialize in
yeah,
this now, and they can support you too. So definitely talk about it. And but the biggest thing is Jesus will rescue. He's
mhm,
if you have come this far and know that something's not
right,
right and that you need to
yeah,
leave, and maybe you haven't left, Jesus is trying to
yeah,
tell you something, that it's when that he can give you that courage, and you talk to him, you go straight to him, you don't go through a
mhm,
pastor that is manipulating, or another church member. Maybe it's not a pastor, maybe it's a
yeah,
church member that is causing
right,
spiritual abuse and having judgmental, um, and sometimes it's called
yes,
gaslighting, where they make you feel this
yeah,
way and lead you to
yeah,
believe that. So that can happen a lot
yeah,
too. And but it is a definitely find the right support. But number one, talk about it, but know that Jesus has you. Jesus has your back. He always has. And you can go straight to him where you can find all of that love and comfort that you didn't get before.
And I know, this podcast doesn't really reach teenagers, but you were a teenager, I was a teenager, where we both were feeling that pull from the Holy Spirit saying something's not right here. It's hard for a teenager in an authoritarian home, in an authoritarian church, to say, I don't want to go anymore. I don't have any advice for that. I don't ever want to say go against your parents, but I know that as a teenager, as an adult, looking back to when I was a teenager in that church, I can cry and say, why didn't I ever stand up for myself and leave or do something? I don't know if you have any thoughts on being a teenager and having this call to leave.
That's a tricky one because in the authoritative church, everything is about the pastor and the head of the home, who, of course, is the father in this type of IBF theology. And you have to see, first off, if you can talk to your parents. I had to be careful about that for a long time and how I did that. And it took some time to be able to do that. I kept it to myself for a long time because I was very young. So when of course, I had to go to church. There was no question. You were going
3 days a week.
So as a young girl, I would just bring my little notebook. My parents did encourage me to take notes, so I would be paying attention. So I did bring a notebook, but it didn't mean they didn't check it. So sometimes I would just draw, or maybe I would write some poetry for just to kind of express myself a little bit. So I would, in my mind, I would be still, and I would just kind of have that happy moment with me in my notebook. But if you had a close friend to confide in, and if you don't have that, there are resources available that they can.
Yeah, it is tricky as a teenager, but I do want to encourage anyone listening that if you are in a church that you feel is spiritually abusing you, emotionally abusing you, especially if you are in a church that turns a blind eye to the fatherly abuse, or if you've come out of that and you are still dealing with the trauma of that and the grief of that and realizing, what happened to you in that church. Like Kimalee said, there are resources, there are counselors now who are trained in dealing with this kind of church hurt. And I encourage you to get the help and the support and not turn your back on God, because these people are operating outside of the authority of God, not under his authority. Because he says, Jesus says, take care of my sheep. And he talks about, especially, I think it's in Leviticus. I'm reading through the Bible, and I was reading in Leviticus recently, and there's even some harsh condemnation to the priests if they didn't take care of the tribes, of what is going to happen to them if you lead them astray. And so, just because they are pastors, it doesn't mean they are doing what God asked them to do or operating under how He wants them to operate. So, what does your book look like? Have you shown that to us?
No, I have it here. So let's share it to you.
So this is Under Authority by Kimalee Finelli. You can find this on Amazon. I encourage you, especially if you've come from a church like this, go ahead and read it. It might take some time to get through. I know there are some wounds that I have a hard time getting through some of those stories and having to relive that. But knowing that you're not alone. We have gone through this. Other people have gone through this. Finding the support you need to not sit in this condemnation, but to find the love and joy and peace, acceptance from God, because that's what Jesus came down here for, is to tell us that we are loved and cherished and valued. So Thank you so much, Kimalee, for joining us today. I love talking about this. And before we leave, is there anything else you would like to add or share before we say goodbye?
Just that you are loved, cherished, and valued in the eyes of God. And if you get a chance to read my story, I do talk about the not only what happened in the story, but the why. A lot of people do ask the
Yes.
why. I spent a whole chapter on the why and how it happens and the why, and but also that hope and redemption as well. And redemption is for
Yes.
everyone.
And restoration. Restoration happens. We're
Absolutely.
going to be speaking in a couple of months. I'm interviewing somebody who is going to talk to us about restoration and what that looks like and how we can get healing from our past and by coming to God and seeking restoration. So, Kimalee, thank you for joining us today. And I hope you have a great weekend. Take care.